So these are the videos for week 10. They're going to be on friendship. Mainly what we'll do this week is expand on some of the topics that we touched on last class and give a more fleshed out presentation, both of what Aristotle is saying and also the central importance of friendship for living a good and happy life. What I want to start with in this first video, though, is just to kind of give a bit more of an overview of what Aristotle was saying about friendship, and to then in the later videos offer a further expansion on that and reflection about some of what he's saying and its relevance today. So, what's interesting about Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, is that he devotes two whole books to the topic of friendship. He talks more about friendship than he does about courage, about temperance, about any other individual virtue. He talks more about friendship than he does about habits. He actually talks more about friendship than he does about virtue per se. So it's really a central topic. It's often overlooked when we're discussing this issue of the happy life or the good life, because there's a way in which it's all about, well, if I have my soul properly ordered, and if my soul is operating as it should, and I'm acting virtuously, I have made this a deep and well ingrained habit and pattern in my life, then I have achieved a happy life. I'm living a happy life. That is a true perspective, I think, true to Aristotle, but it's inadequate. It's insufficient to capture the depth of what he's getting at. So, what we kind of have to do, I think, to really offer more discussion on Aristotle's sense of friendship is to back up and say, well, Aristotle has discussed human nature at the very beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. So human nature is a background topic, if you will, something on his mind when he's delving into the topic of how do I live a good human life. Part of that for him is, well, what does it mean to be human? And based on that understanding, what can we say about how can one live a good, happy, fulfilled human life? So we looked earlier at how for Aristotle, human nature involved a soul, that we were ensouled beings, and that our soul had three faculties: rational, appetitive, and nutritive faculties, and that the proper operation and activity of that soul with the rational faculty leading, governing, etc., was constitutive of the happy life. That is 100% the case, but I just want to expand on that now. So Aristotle also contends that human beings are by nature social or political beings. So it's never the case that a human being can be what he is fully in isolation. There is no possible world in which there's a fulfilled human being and there's nobody else around with whom he has a sense of community or a set of relationships with. Aristotle would basically say, as humans, we are meant to be together. We're meant to live communally. And this is not something that we have developed over the years. It's not some part of our nature that just happened to show up. This is part and parcel of what it means to be a human being. Um, One interesting way to think about it is to reflect, works of science fiction or fantasy or whatever, where you think about somebody who's in totally cut off from everybody else. And even if their physical needs are met, eventually the person's emotional, psychological, mental health declines precipitously. The person just becomes, in a way, less than human. He loses part of its humanity. What that indicates is that the person needs to be with others in order to be human. Now, we see this right from the beginning, I think, when we think about small children, babies, small children. They need other people around them, obviously, to care for all of their basic needs. But more important, well, I don't know if more importantly, but alongside that, they also need other people to teach them, to guide them, to reinforce their value, to give them a sense of what they should do and not do, to show affection, to show love, to show kindness, to show compassion. And in that process, kind of help the person grow. Without that reinforcement and attention and care, the child fails to thrive. There's been interesting work done on babies raised in orphanages where they didn't have that sort of attention and they had a failure to thrive. So this is just another indication of the fact that from the very beginning of our lives, we are caught up in a social set of relations and societies and communities, and we need that in order to grow and develop as human beings. Without that, we become, says Aristotle, basically less than human. We become almost like animals. We become a very bizarre and defunct version of a human being. So all of that leads us toward the idea, says Aristotle, that friendship is an essential topic to discuss when we're discussing what it means to live a happy human life. If being in a society, being in relationship with others, being in a community is part of our human nature, then to fulfill that human nature is to be in a good community with others and to live well with others, not just with oneself. So, this is why friendship becomes such a central and important topic for Aristotle, because he is basing his ideas on the fact that humans are social beings, that we live communally with others, that we are relational beings. And because of that, our fulfillment is going to involve the way we live our relationships, the type of relationships we have, how well we enact those relationships, how deep and profound they are in our lives, how well we live socially with others. All of those become central questions, central issues as we discuss what it means to live a good life. So that's why this book, like the Nicomachean Ethics, devotes two whole books to the discussion on friendship. Now, what we talked about last class was Aristotle's marks of a friendship, that it's, first of all, a friendship is a situation where one person has deep affection, care, and goodwill for somebody else. The second mark is that that person returns the goodwill, affection, and care. And the third mark is that both people recognize it. We discussed how for Aristotle, furthermore, there are three basic types of friendship. There's a friendship of the good or virtuous friendship, which he calls the most perfect form of friendship. There's the friendship of pleasure, and there's a friendship of utility. Now, we had some good discussions on that. I don't feel like we need, I mean, I could expand on that, but I think that hopefully that's pretty clear. Now, what I want to kind of get into now are some of the further points that we didn't touch on in class last time. Now, one of them has to do with this idea of equality. It's kind of a strange thing, but I think we can kind of parse out what Aristotle's getting at. So Aristotle's, after delving into this discussion of the friendship of utility and pleasure and good, and seeing how they're different and how they're related and different features of them and stuff like that, he starts getting into this discussion about, like, well, what if a father becomes friends with a son, or a leader, his relationship to his people, etc. What do we say about that? Well, here, to best understand this, we should kind of go back to Aristotle's ideas on justice. And again, for Aristotle, there was something almost like mathematical about justice, right? That rectifying justice, for example, meant that I use the analogy of the seesaw, right? If person A had taken from person B, then rectifying justice means that now person B has to pay back something of equal value. So that he has taken more, he's brought the seesaw down here, and now he has to bring it back level. Or distributive justice also involves a mathematical sense of things. So that if I'm going to pay one of my employees a certain amount of money, it's just that I pay the second employee a commensurate amount of money, because they're both doing the same amount of work. I have to distribute in an equal and fair fashion the amount of money or honor or good things, whatever it is, such that this is now distributed justly. Now, equality, fairness, balance, those are all very essential, as we saw, to Aristotle's ideas about what it means to be just. And they also pertain to friendship. Now, let's look at this and also see how friendship kind of goes a little bit beyond justice. So, how does it pertain? Well, one of the things Aristotle says is that if two people are friends or have a relationship of this sort, and they're of different classes, or there's a certain inequality between them, they can't exactly give to each other the same thing. So, for example, a ruler in relationship to his subjects. Now, what does he give them? Well, he gives them protection. He gives them oversight. He gives them leadership that allows their community to function well. That kind of gift, says Aristotle, is not something that the subjects can give back to the ruler. They don't have the authority or the power to do that. They can't give him like the same kind of sense of protection. They can't give him that leadership because he's in charge. He's the leader. So what can they give him, says Aristotle? Well, they can give to him honor and respect and obedience. So let's try to look at this a little bit mathematically. To some extent, I think it works, is to say, look, the intensity with which and the energy given by the leader in giving protection and leadership and guidance to his subjects, that intensity and energy should be matched on the part of the subjects by the way they express obedience and honor toward the leader. So it's not that they're giving the same thing to each other, but it's that they're giving different gifts, but in equal fashion. To put it in more mathematical terms, they're both giving an equal amount of energy into the relationship, albeit from different perspectives and giving different sorts of things. So that kind of equalizing factor, says Aristotle, allows people who are of different stations in life, different positions in life, he would call them basically different classes in life, to have some sort of relationship. Because there's now some degree of equality that brings them together. That's a kind of an odd thing to think about because, especially here in the United States and in the West in general, we don't have this sense of like social stratification, social differentiation, one class being above another class, etc. It's much more of a egalitarian society, which would imply, therefore, kind of basic equality of people. You probably wouldn't have people in the United States who would write on friendship and wonder, geez, can a rich person be friends with a poor person? That seems a bizarre question, almost like a horrible question to ask for us. For Aristotle's a different time period. He's looking at a Athenian society that is very much class differentiated. There's different classes. There's those who are landowning and wealthy. There are slaves. There's masters. Women don't have the women are in one sense the property of men. So there's all sorts of differences in society, and he thinks that the way that you can have a person from one group of society be friends with a person from a different group is you have this equality that we were talking about, equalizing of energy, equalizing of amount of intensity that you put into the relationship and the way you do it. Another example he talks about that may be helpful here is a father to a son. So Aristotle says, look, the parent or the father has given to his son the very gift of life. And he's given him protection and care, guidance. He's taught him, he's housed him, etc. He's given so much to the son. Then the son cannot repay that in turn. He cannot give his father back the gift of life because his father already exists. So the father has given to his son here so much that the son has a debt that he can never repay in turn. There's no gift of equal value, says Aristotle, that can be given back. So what can the son do, though? Well, again, he can give back to his father, especially as he gets older, says Aristotle, and he matures and his father starts to depend on him more. He can give back with equal intensity, equal amount of energy, equal focus, equal level of care for his father that his father has given him. So looking at it, let's put another way to say this is that looking at it objectively, what the father has given to the son, the very gift of life in this case, is much, much more objectively valuable, says Aristotle, than anything that the son can ever give back to his father. He can't give something of equal value back. However, let's look at it also subjectively. Subjectively, the way the father cares for the son and is beneficial for him and takes an interest in him is the sort of thing that the son can return to the father in the way that he cares for him and the way that he loves him. So objectively, it's not equal, but subjectively, they can have some sort of equality in the way that they care for each other. That's what Aristotle is kind of getting at in terms of these different types of friendship among people of different stations in life, different classes, different situations, how they can have a subjectively equal form of care or affection or goodwill according to what's proper to their situations, but it brings them together. Now, I said earlier that there's also a way in which friendship goes a little bit beyond justice. Well, Aristotle talks about this, and it's actually fairly easy to understand. So, you know, if a bank lends me $50, for example, now it's weird amount of money, $500, it's the just thing for me is to pay that money back. If I were to not do so, I would be being unjust. I would take something that's not mine, and the rectifying justice is for me to pay it back and bring the fairness back into the equation. And that's just true no matter who loaned me the money, whether it's bank one, bank two, bank three, or a credit union, or some other money lender. Now let's look at this in terms of friendship, though. It may be the case that if my friend lends me money, I then see that he's in a difficult way in a couple of weeks later. Okay. Now, the just thing for me in regard to the bank lending me money was to say, okay, they say, okay, you have 4 months to pay it back. And if I pay it back within 4 months, it's fine. All right. My friend lends me the money and he says, oh, pay it back when you can. But then I see he's in trouble and he's my friend. So here, it's not just about doing kind of like the legal thing and paying it back in the specified amount of time. It's recognizing the particular needs of my friend and responding to those. So it's not just purely mathematical in that sense. It's also about there's a personal issue at play here. All right. Or, it may be the case that I would lend out my car for a day to a neighbor because that's the neighborly thing to do. And my neighbor has helped me in the past, and it's kind of just for me to do something in return for him. And that's kind of a basic thing that we would do. However, if my friend asked me for the use of a car for an extended period of time, I may be willing to do that. I'm kind of going above and beyond what basic justice would say. Well, justice would say, okay, my neighbor has lent me the use of his snowblower throughout a couple days this winter. It might be just for me to lend him the use of my car as a way of paying him back. But with friendship, it's not just about paying back. It's about going above and beyond to help. So the friendship places greater demands on us, says Aristotle, that like we're not just operating in a normal level of justice, like, be generally fair, pay your bills on time, pay back on time, uh, be equitable toward people, etc. Those are basic demands of justice. But when we have a friendship, there's a further obligation to really try to assist the person, to really give a damn about what the person is going through and be there for the person. So sometimes it might mean, you stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning talking to the person because they're having a really, really rough time of it. Or sometimes, like I said, it might mean you lend the person the use of your car or the use of your house or whatever it is, just to help the person get back on its feet. Now, lending the use of your house to a stranger is not something that we would do. We have an obligation as citizens to pay taxes, some of which taxes may provide for social welfare benefits that would assist somebody in need. And I think that is a basic level of social justice that we are obliged to do. However, that basic level of social justice is something we go well beyond on when we have friendship, because our relationship is deeper and it's the sort of thing that we really, really care about and can do something directly about. And because of that fact, and because the person we are friends with cares about us too and cares deeply about us, we have an obligation, says Aristotle, to go well beyond that. And you're not just not paying taxes, but it's about giving of yourself and giving of your resources in a very direct and profound and intense way to assist your friend in need. So, though in general, friendship does have kind of especially when we're talking about the friendship between people who are of different stations in life, different groups of society, says Aristotle, there is sort of a need for equality. And it seems, it's kind of like justice. There is also, as we just said, a way in which friendship goes beyond what justice would demand of us. Okay, so another thing that Aristotle gets at that I think is really worth exploring here is this idea of what he calls like concord and goodwill. Okay, because he says these are two things that are really connected to friendship, but they're not commensurate with it. And I think once we parse this out, we can see better what he's getting at when we talk about friendship. So when we think about goodwill, Aristotle's talking about situations like where you start to admire somebody and you think, oh, that person's pretty good at something, or that person is very interesting. I'd like to get to know that person more, right? The person has very enjoyable company. And you kind of have a sense like, oh, I hope this works out for the person, or you have an interest in the person. And you have a more particular specified interest in the person than you do to people in general. And that's something we should pause and reflect on, right? Like you see a lot of people every day, and we don't usually wish such people ill, but we don't really take a lot of interest in the person unless something happens, like we see the person's car is broken down the side of the road and we have to help them, or we start to engage in conversation with the person, you know, or the person comes to us and asks for help, or um, whatever the case may be, that specifies our interest in the person. So goodwill, says Aristotle, kind of arises when we have that more specific interest in somebody, and we start to actually care to some extent about the person and how he's doing, and we ask about him and see how, say how are the, how's the family, whatever, and it becomes something of a meaningful question, and it's not just the question that sometimes people ask, like, how are you doing, which is another way of saying hello. We mean more. We want the person to be doing okay at least. Now Aristotle says this is good. This is important, and it can be a good and intense feeling. But it's not the same as friendship. And this is where it gets kind of interesting because it's fairly easy to think, well, if I have this sense of, more specified interest in the person or goodwill, doesn't that mean that I'm friends with the person? Aristotle says no. Part of the reason I think is that we don't this doesn't actually imply a genuine sense of having an intimate bond with the person. We haven't actually really opened ourselves up to the other person or have the other person open himself up to us. We haven't learned to share more of the depths of ourselves with the other person, nor have we had to like really stand by the person in difficult times. We haven't gotten below the surface, in other words. So I think what Aristotle's getting at, to use a metaphor, is to say, when you have goodwill, it gets you, say this is the other person, it gets you to the surface level with the other person. You're there. You're having some engagement with the person. Prior that you just would have passed the person by. Now you kind of turn your attention toward the person and you have an engagement with him. You want to know a little bit more about him. You take an interest in him. You do care for him on some level. But friendship is when you start getting below the surface. So it's not just about the person in his job capacity and your work relationship to him. It's not just about the person in as your mailman, for example, or a UPS delivery guy, a guy I used to know in New Hampshire. I was thinking about because he was the FedEx delivery guy at the place I worked at, and I enjoyed his company. He was nice to talk to. We chat, but it never got below the surface. So it was not. It was just sort of a surface level goodwill, but not friendship. Okay. Um, so friendship is when you know the person more essentially rather than just in his role as a coworker, somebody you see occasionally, a teammate, etc., where you actually see the bigger picture about the person. You get a deeper glimpse of the person's soul and what the person's life is like. Now, what's interesting about this too, and I think very important to reflect on, is the fact that this is where things get, shall we say, a little messy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we all have a capacity to present ourselves at least fairly well in normal social interactions. And what I mean fairly well is in a normal, everyday way. We're not acting in a bizarre fashion, and we can present ourselves in such a way that things seem okay with us. Now, I earlier talked about that question that's asked, how are you doing? This is a part of the way we can present ourselves at our job, at our church, sports team, uh, you know, with our neighbors, etc., in such a way that things seem okay. All right. Nobody will usually start to give a 1 hour long monologue to the mailman about the fact that his life is in shambles and he is having an existential crisis. Now, maybe sometimes it would be good if that happened. And I mean that because sometimes it just gets things out and it's honest. But we don't usually do that. We have a way of presenting ourselves. Now, some people call this like a level of appearances. And it's not that it's fake necessarily, can be, but it's not necessarily it's fake. It's just shallow. It's just a way of giving our presentation of ourselves to the people around us and doing so in a manner that is pretty normal and regular. So, like just to expand on this a bit more, when I go to work at the ski resort where I work at, people say, "How you doing?" I say pretty well. We have some conversations about stuff. Um, we chat. The expression often used is to shoot the shit in the United States. Whatever. And sometimes it starts getting a little deeper, which is good. But often it's kind of on the surface level. And I say things are going pretty well, and um, I don't share a lot of like deep secrets about my life or anything. And everything seems pretty good. We enjoy, you know, you enjoy people's company, you have fun together, you start taking an interest in people there. But the key, says Aristotle, is there's a transition, there's a shift. And it's the metaphor I've been using is that you shift from just the way you are at work or the way you are with your neighbors to the way you are in the depths of your soul and in the depths of your personhood and the messiness and the complexity and the stress and the whatever starts to become something that you talk about with the friend, that you become present to the other person, not just in your capacity as a coworker, but in your very humanity and in your in the deepest sense of who you are. Um, I mean, the one way to describe it, it's like you begin to know somebody not just as the coworker, as the mailman, or you know, the neighbor, but as Ryan or as Mike or whomever it is. You know that person, not just the specific particular job or role that he's inhabiting at that point. So that's what I mean about going deeper, going below the surface. And of course, it does get messy. But I think that's sort of key to friendship is that we talked about this in class last week too. Um, Virtue is not just an activity, it's a journey. And a journey to virtue implies lots of detours, lots of pit stops, lots of ups and downs. That journey to happiness is fraught with peril, shall we say, and it's never a completion. We're always on the way toward it and toward greater happiness and fulfillment in life. So when you get to that level of life where you're actually honest about your journey to in life, it's not going to be completely pretty. It's not going to always be understandable to people, and it's not going to be something a lot of people may want to hear about. Um, Let me give an analogy to kind of flesh this out a little bit. You know, when you lose a friend, for example, or a parent, it it's not it's difficult to sometimes share that grief with other people. Okay, and Aristotle himself actually talks about this, and he says, I think something that's completely wrong because he says, well, you know, it's not very manly to do that. You don't want to be womanly and share your grief with other people and burden them with that. I think he's dead wrong in that. I think that grief is just a part of the human condition and it's part of our human life. So what I'm getting at here is the following. When when you lose somebody in your life, you know who your friends are because you can share that grief with them and they want to listen. And sometimes they don't say anything. Sometimes they do and it's helpful, but they're just there for you. They let you grieve. They let you be yourself in that situation. They're comforting in a non-evasive way almost, which is a really beautiful thing. And it's profound and it's messy and it's difficult, but it's very real. And it's a perfect example of what I'm getting at, where you're not just saying somebody's saying, I'm sorry for your loss, and they may mean it, but it's still only kind of on a surface level of engagement. Whereas the real friend who's gone beyond the goodwill, if you will, here is one who wants you to share, wants to listen, wants to just sit with you while you express this grief, wants to let you have the ability to express it and doesn't interrupt and doesn't say, "Oh, geez, I got to get going," or anything like that. They let you be the grief, let you express and feel and manifest this grief, this pain, and this sorrow, and all they attended, if you will, messiness, because they've cared about you on that level of who you are, not just the surface level of who you are. So this example just clarifies, I think, what I'm getting at, how friendship is a movement beyond or a shift beyond surface level goodwill, in which you engage with the other person in the depths of his soul and who he really most deeply is, and you care about that person, and you want to be present for that person, and you try to respond to that person at that level. And this again is where I was saying that intimacy comes in, because now you're vulnerable and you share and you open yourself up. Of course, what happens is that in doing so, we can get hurt. This is why a lot of people avoid intimacy, because intimacy of this level is entails, actually, I should say, it entails vulnerability. You are going to be vulnerable around somebody when you open yourself up, when you talk about, for example, as we were saying earlier, your grief, or when you talk about situations in life that are really troubling you, or you talk about your own doubts about yourself. That means that the person could turn around and use that against you, or criticize you for it, or just never talk to you again because he can't accept that about you. And so it's a risk to go below the surface. Okay, that's part of, I think, what Aristotle's getting at too, is that friendship does involve a risk. On this level, it's pretty easy to just have normal everyday interactions with people. It's easy to make that presentation, say, oh, just play the role of the friendly coworker, or the decent neighbor, and this is fine. This is a good part of life, but it's a lot riskier to go below the surface and get to know not only the other person but yourself more deeply, and see all the stuff that comes up, and all the uncertainties, and all the doubts, and all the anxieties, and all the grief, and all the messiness, if you will, that would come with that engagement with a deeper level of yourself and the other person. So we run a risk, I think is what Aristotle's getting at, but unless we run that risk, the goodwill never actually fully transitions into genuine friendship. So that's goodwill. It brings us to that surface, starts us moving toward friendship, but more is needed. And the more that is needed is this deep engagement in order for a genuine and good friendship to develop and to flourish. What about concord? Well, concord, says Aristotle, is like being of one mind, or being in deep accord with the other person. Now, this is where I think he gets really clear and really interesting, because he says, look, it's not just a being of one mind about certain things, like, okay, we both agree that uh, we both like quantum physics or something, or we both agree about certain historical interpretations of events, or some other kind of academic set of ideas, or we both agree that the New York Yankees are the best baseball team. That's not actually it. It goes much deeper. So what's the analogy Aristotle draws in order to start to flesh this out? Well, the analogy he draws is no surprise. He starts talking about a political community, because he's often bringing in the political community to illustrate ideas about friendship, and bring in ideas about friendship to illustrate ideas about the political community. So what does he say about the political community that helps us understand this idea of concord better? Well, what he says is that the political community that has one mind, or concord, is one in which citizens agree, for example, that a representative form of government is the best approach, and they work together and in concert for that goal. They strive toward it, they're committed to it. There might be some slight disagreements, but in general, they're saying this is what we want, and we're going to try to make this happen because we think this is best for our community. And we're all kind of united in this idea. And the implication that's there, which he doesn't expand on, but I think it's worth mentioning briefly, is that if you don't have this, of course, the political community gets torn apart, gets torn asunder. So the concord brings the community together and focuses them on a specific goal for their communal health and flourishing. Now, what that says about friendship is that friendship is also the concord of friendship is something where two people have the same ideas about or are of the same mind, as Aristotle would say, about things that are important for both of them and for their friendship. So it's not just about kind of incidental things like, okay, yeah, you know what, we both agree that um, the Confederates possibly could have won the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. Yeah, that's interesting, but it's not, it's again kind of surface level stuff. What Aristotle says is that concord in friendship is about a deep agreement on what's deeply important to both people. So, for example, they'll both agree that trying to overcome a specific vice is important, and they'll try to work with each other to do that. They'll be the sort of people who offer what we talked about last time, fraternal correction to each other. There's an accountability there. There's almost like a way in which they're just honest to each other about this because they both see this is important for both of us to do this. Okay, or they'll both agree that um, praying more often is important. So it's not just about avoiding something bad, but a positive doing something good, or contemplation is important. And they'll kind of check in with each other to see how they're doing. They'll talk about ideas that have worked and have not worked in the pursuit of this practice of prayer or contemplation. They'll encourage each other to do it more often. They'll pick each other up when they haven't done it the way they wanted to. They want to build up the other person because they're both in pursuit of this same kind of goal. They have this one, they're of one mind, they have an agreement, they're in accord with each other, they're in concord toward this one goal, which they both think is essential and deeply important to living well. And again, because it's essential and deeply important, it's not just an incidental thing. It has to do with like, how am I, questions that are relevant here is, how does this help me become more virtuous? How does this help me avoid certain vices? How does this help me overcome this incontinent pattern in my life? How does this help me reinforce a good way of living? How does this help me pursue the true, the good, and the beautiful, in other words? So it's an agreement about what's most essential in life, and it's an agreement in which the two people help each other to achieve that essential thing. Um, and I kind of think it's important to reflect just for a second on the fact that we may lose track of that to some extent in today's world. So there are, social media groups or Facebook groups or whatever where people come together for all sorts of shared interests, if you will. Um, they have a shared interest in a sports team. They have a shared interest in this type of dancing. They have a shared interest in hiking, all of which are great. I love hiking, for example. I love the New York Yankees, in an analogous sense of love, obviously. Um, and I like to go to Yankees games sometimes and, celebrate with other fans there. That's fine. But that's not, I mean, this social media world that we live in where it tries to like bring people together and bring people together of who have like shared interests, that's not the kind of concord that Aristotle's talking about. And the best way to think about that is again to talk about the analogy I used. That's a surface level issue. Like, it's not essential to me that I like the New York Yankees. If it were, then something is seriously wrong with me. And I mean that. Like, it's that's not the deepest essence of who I am. Nor is it the deepest essence of who I am that I've had various jobs in various states or something like that. So I when we're thinking about the deepest parts of somebody and the need to be in concord with other people in order to have a deep and fulfilling friendship, we can't it's not the case that we can list off things, I think, like shared interest in sports team or shared interest in a recreational activity. Again, those can be good and those can lead into a deeper friendship, but they're not the essence and the core of what it means to be human. And it's easy, I think, and this is something Aristotle does talk about too. So sometimes we get lost, we get confused about, there's a better word, Matt. We get confused about these things and we think, okay, I have this shared interest with this person. We seem to have this, we're of one accord here. And to go back to the earlier topic, we seem to have goodwill toward each other. And then you infer from those facts that, oh, okay, we have a really deep and good friendship here. But Aristotle is saying, like, pause for a second. He's he's asking us to reflect and ask ourselves questions like, well, how deep is the friendship? How intimate is it? How much vulnerability is there? How much have you really helped each other grow in virtue? How much have you talked with the other person about what your life is actually like? Not just on the everyday level where everything's okay, but on the deep level where maybe it's not okay. How much are you willing to go? How far are you willing to go to help the person and vice versa? Are you willing to stay up all night and talking to this person? Do you even have any interest ever in doing anything like that? And I think what Aristotle is saying is like, if the answer is no, then that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean you have no friendship. It just means that it's more of a friendship of pleasure, perhaps, or it's something that could grow into a friendship of virtue, but it's not there yet, and that's fine. He's saying, but we get into trouble when we start making these confusions. And I've had this happen before. I presume other people have too, where you think, okay, this is a deep and really important friendship. This is again where you not only get hurt by the other person, you kind of get burned by the other person. You The other person takes advantage of you. Things can go really wrong. You might waste a lot of time and energy on this stuff. And Aristotle's like, look, it's important to just reflect, how deep has the relationship gone? How has it helped you to grow in virtue? How is it inching you toward the true and the good and the beautiful? Because that's what it means to be human, is to move toward the true and the good and the beautiful. And if you're not doing that with this, if the other person's not really deeply sharing that journey with you, that's perfectly fine. That's a fine relationship to have, but don't think of it as essential. I think that's kind of the point he's getting at. So that's what I mean about what we have with what's the concord and goodwill. Um, the main thing to keep in mind here is that when a friendship, a really good and deep friendship starts to develop, it means that the concord has gone into a deeper level and the goodwill has gone into a deeper level. Okay, now another thing I think worth mentioning here is Aristotle's ideas on self-love. So this can get a little bit confusing sometimes because he basically says, look, he literally says friendship is based on self-love. And you're like, okay, that doesn't make any sense, really, because I thought friendship was about like wanting what's best for the other person, be willing to go great distances to help the other person, sacrificing yourself for the other person. This seems like you're negating yourself for the sake of the other person. So that's one kind of thing, one kind of response that we would have to Aristotle's idea that friendship is based on self-love. Another response, and again, a very understandable and reasonable response, is to say the following. Hey, you know what? People who have self-love, they're very selfish. They want what's best just for themselves. They're looking out for number one, as the expression goes. They don't really go beyond themselves. So if they're self-referential, if they have this very intense focus on themselves, how could they ever how could they ever be on the lookout for deep relationships? How could they ever really care deeply about somebody else as much as they care about themselves? If it's all about me, then there's not a lot about the other person. how do we have a relationship? How can it go toward a friendship that's good and virtuous? So those are two, I think, very legitimate questions to ask when we hear about Aristotle's idea that friendship is based on self-love. But what Aristotle says is he actually can respond, I think, um, to both of those claims. So what Aristotle says is that first of all, okay, when we love ourselves, really, and not just like when we genuinely love ourselves, we want what's best for ourselves. Okay, we want to be at peace with ourselves, and we look to have a good, solid unification of our souls. Now, let me explain what that means because that's kind of an odd statement. Um, when we genuinely love ourselves, we're not at war with ourselves. We're not trying to get what's bad for us and do what's good. We're not fighting. One part of our soul is not fighting each other. Okay, we have a properly ordered soul because we're pursuing what's good and what's best for us, says Aristotle. So that we're actually, and we're not embarrassed by ourselves. We're not ashamed of ourselves, says Aristotle. We are, at sense, at peace with ourselves. We're happy with ourselves. We're pursuing what's best for ourselves, and in short, we're living well. So what Aristotle is getting at is not that those who love themselves try to take more than they deserve. It's not that they try to get everything that's not good for them. It's not that they're always trying to, obtain this pleasure or maximize every sort of, or fulfill every desire they have and just get anything they possibly can at whatever time they can, be it money or sex or power, prestige, safety, and security in life. No, what he says is that this person who genuinely loves himself is actually a person with a well-ordered soul who's pursuing what's good, who's at peace with himself, who's not at whose soul and whose personhood is unified, like I said earlier, is working well together. The parts of the soul, the faculties of the soul, stuff that we've talked about in this class. Um, so this person is, and there's a certain harmony with himself. So what Aristotle says that responds to that second criticism that it's just about selfishness. No, it's not selfishness so much as pursuit of what's good and living harmoniously and well with oneself. So what Aristotle says is that if we have this love for ourselves, we have a good relationship to ourselves. We don't look at ourselves with shame. We're not embarrassed by ourselves. We don't hate ourselves for things that we've done. We can have a sense that, okay, this my life is going well. I'm happy with it. And I want to keep pursuing what's good for it. And I have a way in which I'm totally committed to that. I'm not like the incontinent person who's very much torn about saying, "Oh, I want this, but I know I shouldn't have it," or I want to actually indulge, but I know I shouldn't. No, there's a peaceable, harmonious way of life for this person, says Aristotle. Okay, so if that's the case, what Aristotle then says is like this relationship that the virtuous person or the good person has to himself is very similar to and the kind of relationship he has to his friend. So the way he relates to himself is then expressed in the way he relates to his friend. He wants what's best for his friend. We talked about living in concord or harmony with the other person. He's at peace with the other person. And he's not ashamed of the other person. He's not embarrassed by the other person. He wants to be with the other person and wants the other person to continue to exist just as much as he wants himself to continue to exist, to continue to live well. And so this self-love that the person has for himself provides him, says Aristotle, with kind of a paradigm of what he'll express and manifest to his friend. So the way that we relate to ourselves then kind of becomes expressed in the way we relate to other people. Not a selfishness, but what Aristotle calls a true self-love. Um, I think there's I think he's on to something here. I'd also offer though that the following, that when we can have deep relationships with other people and not totally have genuine self-love. Um, and sometimes the other person's love for us helps us to love ourselves better. And we need that in order to love ourselves better. So I think Aristotle's actually he's presenting a situation. He's not taking into account the dynamism of life. In other words, our relationship to ourselves and our relationship to other people develop together. Okay, they don't just develop separately. Like one's relationship to oneself becomes solid, and then that gets expressed to other people in a good friendship. To some extent, that does happen, but it's also the case that the relationship that I have with somebody else influences my relationship with myself. So they complement each other in a way that I don't think Aristotle fully articulates. And I think it's just important to reflect on that the relationship I have with myself is not just the basis for my relationship for somebody else. My deep relationship with my friend also influences my relationship with myself. Um, so let me kind of wrap up the discussion we've had so far on this further overview of some of these ideas with Aristotle. So we talked about different the equality involved in friendship, the way that friendship actually goes beyond justice. We talked about goodwill. We talked about concord and how those go deeper, and that's what allows them to become part of a genuine and good friendship. And the final thing we talked about was how self love is a basis or the basis for a good friendship, but self love not in terms of selfishness, but in terms of pursuit of what is good, wanting what's best, and wanting what's best for myself. That is the same intention I have when I want what's best for my friend. That's why Aristotle has this idea that, like, because I want what's best for myself and my friend is another self, I'll ultimately want what's best for him. All right, so that's the lecture one for week 9.